morning again, everybody. Welcome to Sunday Mornings with Mike. My name is Peter Walsh, and I'm the rector of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, and delighted and honored once again to have Mike Handler with us. Mike is the Emergency Management Director for the town of New Canaan. If we could begin with prayer, as has become our custom, I'm going to pray out of my tradition. I ask that you pray out of your tradition, and if you have no religious tradition, I ask that you send your good thoughts and energy to those on the front lines, those in need, or those who are particularly dear to your heart. So let us pray. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this morning. Give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous. And all for your love's sake. Amen. So, Mike, welcome back.
Good morning.
We've now done so much of this. I know I've lost count on what number we're up to, but we are so delighted to have you back. And it is a gray day out there, but it's a happy day here inside as we look. Just want to reach out to everybody out there and say we're grateful to you for tuning in. And we seek to be of service to you. That's why we have this gathering. So that if you have questions that you would like to ask of Mike, please get on your fingertips there and type them in so Jill can then bring them to us. We really, really want to be of service to you. Mike, as this all unfolds, it gets, in some sense, increasingly complex in a new way. But let's start with some simpler stuff. Let's start with this. Let's start with masks. I wonder if you might say a word about masks, the masks given out in New Canaan, and to help people, coach people through the mask world just a little bit.
Sure. The goal is still to keep people home and isolated and avoid social gatherings. But if you have to go out for critical essential needs like food or pharmaceuticals, wearing a simple face mask is the best way to keep others from getting sick. It doesn't do much to keep you from getting sick, but it keeps others from getting sick from you. We did a distribution pod yesterday, a point of distribution in New Canaan yesterday, and we did it for a number of reasons. Number one, to give people masks that they have no excuse for not wearing a mask when they're out, but also to test the plans that we have had on the books for some time now, but have never truly tried to implement them. So some data from yesterday, we saw, we gave out about 10,600 masks yesterday, which is, again, a lot less than I anticipated giving out. We gave 4 masks out per car, and it went pretty smoothly. I think our throughput was roughly 600 cars per hour in the peak time. I want to thank the public for what appears to be at least listening to their school district zoning requests to come at the hours for their school district, because we did have a pretty even distribution throughout the 6 hours that we were there. And I want to thank the staff, the firefighters, CERT, police that were all there, health department, all there, making sure it went smoothly. And this is important for me because this is, a simple thing, giving out a face mask, but it gets more complicated as you get along with this. So if you had to do testing or vaccination this way, it gives us a sense as to what we can do and how we can get people conditioned to follow directions and get things done in a certain way. So the masks were simple, but vaccinations and testing a little bit more complicated.
So thank you for that. Vaccinations and testing, all those things that we're all hoping to come down the pike here for us. Let's talk a little bit about that. So the way we understand this, we have the health crisis here, we have the economic crisis here. Some people are taking sides. These are actually completely intertwined. The head of COVID-19 response in Germany noted yesterday that to some who are pulling for the economic recovery of Germany, he said, I am, quote, an evil man. There are people taking sides, there is anger arising, and yet we desire, if I might say, to follow the science. And wonder if you could say a little bit about what does follow the science mean?
So just back up for just a second about your comment about economic versus health. There's a balance that needs to be struck, and people that know me well think I see things as either black or white, but there is definitely a balance that needs to be met. There's no doubt in my mind this is a health crisis. You cannot solve a health crisis with economic relief or money. That's what frustrates a lot of people. But I'm also aware of the fact that as we let the impact of the health crisis go on, it's having a detrimental effect on everyone's financial condition and the economy as a whole. So, and I've seen the statistics that, poverty causes health crisis as well in its own way. We get that. But you cannot solve this with a check from the government. It can help mitigate some of the risk and the stress between here and when you have a solution, but this is purely a health crisis that we're dealing with. As far as the science goes, I think in my mind, I've almost absolved myself of the thought of thinking that there's a chance we're going to have a return to normal as we knew it come December or November of this year. I think whatever we do going forward, it's going to be different. It's not going to be necessarily better or worse. It's just going to be different.
Yep.
If you think back to 9/11, I think going back to 2000 when you traveled, you had a vastly different experience traveling than you did post 9/11. And again, I think human beings adapt. Not everyone is enamored with waiting in lines at airports and taking their shoes and their belt off, but we've done that because we believe that it leads to a greater outcome. I think the same is going to be true here. Wow. So I think the return to a new normal will really get here when we see a vaccine. Now, that problem with the vaccine is that that's anywhere from 12 to 18 to 24 months out. That's a long time. So what we're dealing with in this, it was an acute crisis initially. It really is a chronic issue we're dealing with now. This is going to be chronic for some time. And the question is, how much risk are we willing to take between today and when we have that vaccine? And there's things that we can do to mitigate that risk. And we talk about it almost every time I've been here. Yep. But it might be worth repeating. The way you mitigate that risk is by adequate testing. You need to have therapeutics to treat, capacity in your hospitals, and contact tracing. And the testing data is really, really troubling. And I'll tell you just some simple numbers that kind of keep me up at night. Okay. If you look at the rate of the mortality rate for this virus in Connecticut, any idea what it might be? Take a guess. So the flu is a fraction of 1%, like 0.2%.
This is 5%.
So this is in Connecticut, it's running around 7%. Okay, so if you look at, and by the way, if you look at the statistics, if you look at the population of Los Angeles County, it's 2.5 times the population of Connecticut, roughly. Wow. If you look at total California cases, their cases are almost double our cases. But yet our mortality is 1,800 and theirs is 1,600. So there's nothing special about Connecticut, although its proximity to New York could say part of this, can explain it that way. But I think a good part of this is the quantity of testing going on. So I have no doubt, and you look at the best countries, the countries that really locked down. I mean, China did a pretty remarkable job just shutting everything down. And their mortality is somewhere in the 5% range. Yeah. So I don't for a second believe, and I'm not an epidemiologist or a doctor, I don't for a second believe that this virus is going to kill 5% of those infected. I just think we haven't tested enough people to know what the true denominator is in getting to that calculation. So again, the need for testing, both a PCR test, a test for a viral load, and antibody testing is enormous. Everything we read about, I suspect we are confusing motion with progress in a lot of ways. So people have been asking me why we're not doing antibody testing in New Canaan. Well, I can tell you there's two reasons. Number one, the tests aren't accurate. So it depends on what scientific accuracy you want. But for it to be efficacious, you need to have, you can't have 20 to 30% false positive rate.
So I'm just going to pause you there.
Yes.
Okay. 5%, 7%, the denominator issue. The denominator issue is dependent upon testing. And we have the question of faulty. We have not enough tests, and then we have tests that are faulty tests. So we have two issues here on the testing.
So let me give you the issue. Okay, the issue starts at the federal government. Okay, and I'll tell you why. And this is not a political issue. This is just out of need and necessity. We've relaxed a lot of criteria. Right. So I brought with me again this mask. This is the 3M 1860. This is the gold standard for people that are on the front lines doing procedures on patients that aerosolizes the virus. This is the most efficient and effective mask you could have if it fits properly. This is a simple surgical mask. This is not what you need on the front line. Remember, this does not keep you from getting sick. It keeps you from spreading germs to other people. So the CDC guidelines are what regulates what happens on the front lines with PPE. And the CDC has done, again, out of necessity, I imagine, they've relaxed all of their standards to say, You can wear this mask, not single use like it used to be, but for an entire week, where you can clean it. There are things you can do to make it work because it doesn't work. And if this doesn't work, by the way, you can try these other 35 masks that really have never been tested or tried to see if they actually work, because they have to. And that's what people are doing in the front lines. The testing is almost the exact same thing. Traditionally, in this country, and maybe to a point where it's absurd, the FDA makes it almost impossible to get things to the front lines in an emergency. But in this case, they've relaxed almost every standard. So there are test kits on the market that I've been offered to buy for the town that the FDA hasn't looked at, hasn't determined if they are actually going to work. So that's number one. So if we had a test that was actually accurate in quantity, in mass, we'd be testing everybody.
Yeah.
But here's the other problem. And I'm not saying you can wait for everything, all the answers before you start making decisions, but the other problem we have is that nobody really knows, if you get the data back that you and I have been exposed to the virus and have antibodies, what that means. Right? So if you read every day, you'll see different tests that are coming out, or different studies that are coming out that are suggesting that the World Health Organization yesterday came out saying that just because you have antibodies or exposed does not mean you're immune the second time around.
Right.
And I think every doctor that I've spoken to on this topic will tell you that immunity varies based on the virus and the level of antibodies you have in your body, and the types of antibodies that you have in your body. So we just haven't done that work yet. I'm not suggesting that you have to wait everything and do everything in a linear fashion, because it'll take 10 years to get this done. But right now, what we're doing in New Canaan is we're working on the process by which we would be able to test people, the process by which we would be able to vaccinate. I'll give you a very simple analogy. If we wait for a vaccine to be proven to be effective in this virus, to start working on how we're going to make the syringes to administer it globally, we're going to waste another year. So I suspect people are working in parallel paths to figure out how to deliver a vaccine if and when it comes. You can't just wait for the day, hey, we got the vaccine, now what do we do? And go to work fixing on how to deliver it. Same thing with testing. So the testing is critical, because without it, you can't re-engage society, right? You can't do contact tracing if you can't do testing, because the only way you know if they're positive is if you actually have a positive result in the test. So we're working on our contact tracing plans for the town. And again, it's really not that hard when you only have 50, 100 tests you're doing a week, a month. It's not that difficult. You start testing 5,000, 10,000 people in town, that contact tracing becomes very, very difficult. And you know, it's one of these things where we want to not wait for the perfect solution. You got to wait for a good solution. And right now we're kind of somewhere between having a solution and having a good solution.
Okay, very, very, very helpful. I did read about the WHO's pronouncement yesterday that it was unclear whether or not you could get it again, and they had statistics about people from Wuhan who had, in South Korea, who had had COVID-19 and then seemed to have gotten it again, but they're unclear if it's the same thing, it's a morphed thing, and all that. So very, very complicated by individual, never mind masked up in statistic. Very difficult.
Keep in mind, in the back of your mind, you have to always remember that we weren't doing this to keep everybody from getting exposed. We were doing this to prevent a run on critical healthcare infrastructure that we wouldn't have. So we had made a lot of progress, and people should feel at least a little bit comforted by the fact that we have dramatically increased our capacity. I saw in New York City some data yesterday from individual hospitals that suggested that there was a slight increase in the last 3 days of hospitalizations. And it's attributed to the Passover and Easter holiday. So, but again, it's important to understand why, because that is a very small microcosm of what re-engaging society in some small fashion would look like. So, you know, if you have good testing and good data, you can determine if opening up a park or a field or a school or a business leads to increased hospitalizations. And that's how you know how to dial back the freedom that people have.
Okay, so let's pause there for a moment. Interesting about, I'm sorry for my smiling about Easter. We had people who said, oh, we had Easter from a distance and things like this. And we had Passover from a distance. We just spread the table out, and Ramadan has begun. And as you know, the iftar at the end of the day, the gathering to eat at the end of the day, religious holidays getting in the way of world health here. Okay, so we're moving forward here. The testing is a little bit of the wild, wild west out there, and we're trying to figure out how to navigate all of that. Meanwhile, the calendar is moving along. May 20th at one point was a open up, or potential open up for schools and for businesses those businesses that have been shuttered. And now we hear in the state of Connecticut that the advisory group is going to deliver us a study on May 20th. Anything about just time in the state of Connecticut and any news on that means anything to anybody?
I can tell you that I spend 0% of my time worrying about a deadline or a date in the future of being something certain of something happening. I think if you fixate on these dates, you will be seriously disappointed. I think it's important from a human standpoint at home with all the kids that my wife would like to know when the kids go back to school. We all would, as would they. But I don't think there's nothing scientific about picking some random date in the future. People like it. I think it ends up moving the goalposts on people. Things are going to be like this until further notice. That's about as best as I can tell you.
Okay, so we're going to come to questions here in a moment, but so I want to just acute. You as a 17-year-old became an EMS person in college. You worked all night in emergency rooms. Man, you know acute. And now we're into chronic, which is another part of the hospital. And we as the people are having to shift our heart and mindset from acute to chronic. We were very concerned about physical health in the early going, physical health, and now we have a combination of physical health, mental health, and economic health all mixed together, and people trying to make their way through this thing. We now have a timeless time in front of us, and as I understand it, the town, is very attentive to people's mental health as much as possible, and I noticed that the way you do your calling at the end of the day, 7 o'clock calls, is attentive not just to the physical questions, but also to the mental questions. And in the category of no good deed goes unpunished, I just want to say to everybody out there listening, Mike is working really hard to care for you, and he's not trying to depreciate your knowledge of data or anything. I wonder if you just might say a word about your call and the care and keeping and the balance of all of this stuff as it comes together.
Sure. These calls started in 2010, 11, mostly related to storms. Right. And what I tried to do very early on was to deliver the call in the same cadence every single day. Right. And the reason why I did that was because mostly we were listening to see where we were working on what streets. And if I just started with the streets and put it in different parts of the call out, they wouldn't know when to pay attention for their street, and they couldn't go back and listen to it again. So I tried to always give everything the exact same sequence every time I did it, so people knew, quiet, I want to hear what my street's being worked on or not. That has, I guess, carried forward to this, where I've tried to give kind of a similar type of message every day. And it's funny, I don't really spend a lot of time worrying about the criticism or the praise of people on these calls, but I can tell you it's almost 50-50. People think that either I'm some kind of a machine that just sits there and reads things totally without any feeling or care and concern, that I'm reading fatality numbers or things that normally people get upset about, and I just don't seem to care about it, which is not true, obviously. I also get people saying that we don't want you to get have emotion on the call. People want it however they want it and they receive it. I'm sure you see the same thing in the church. People just read things differently than what you're telling them. I can tell you without a doubt that starting the call off with the number of positive cases and the mortality figures in our town is taking a toll not just on all of you, but on me as well. And I'm aware of it. I think the data is important, especially since we're dealing with a pandemic with very little data that people can cling to. Yep. So what I've done, and I've tried it a multiple of different ways. I've tried to give it just at the beginning of the call. I've tried to take a couple days off and spare people the every night call of the data. And then recently I've just put it online. So what I will tell you, if you really do want to see the data, 100% of our data, including the raw data, is up on the website at newcanaan.info. Click on the COVID-19 tab, and there's 2 links at the very top of the page that shares the data. I think that's probably helpful. I want to warn people about the data because it looks like we have a big spike coming up. That's because people all got tested at one day, and the results all came back that one day. I don't think there's if there was something that I could read into the data and share with you, I would do that.
Yep.
It really is just statistical. It's relevant because that's what we have. It's the best that we have. It's not like it's going to tell you some great insight as to what's going to happen next. It's just not going to happen that way. Yeah. As far as the calls go, again, I never envisioned it happening every day for as long as it's going on. I try to share some positive things that are going on in town. I think people need to know kind of what is really happening. But I've also gotten feedback that a lot of the parents we only had adult numbers in the system. Most kids haven't signed up for the system. So it's never really been an issue. But what I'm learning now is because I'm doing it at 7 o'clock, families are sitting down at dinner and listening to the call before they have dinner. And I question the value of having some of this data being just driven home every single night before people sit down at dinner. And I think it's probably best that we kind of deviate from that pattern a little bit.
Okay, wow. I will say that I nearly beat the pulp out of my family in the early going with all the data at the dinner table. I think they just told me to turn the volume down. That was me, not you. But I do want to bring people to those who really want the data is there to the degree, but you're saying that the data has its own weaknesses, and just want to be clear about that. Jill, tell me, what do we got?
Well, if you were ever wondering if people are actually watching and responding in real time, I can tell you they are, because I just got a message that said, "Tell Mike we love his calls. His calm voice and great info are very comforting. His format is wonderful. Send him our best."
Thank you.
So that's
Tell my wife I say hello.
It's not from your wife, I can promise. And also, I'll just start with these because I have control of the microphone. Someone else who wrote in just now to say, to thank you both for your excellent leadership during a public health crisis. It's very comforting. So there you go. That's from the people. Okay, very straightforward question here. Can you explain exactly what the term viral load means?
Sure. In order for you to get sick from a virus, you need to have enough of the virus in your body that triggers a response in your body, like a fever. So the PCR test that we have been doing, the nasal pharyngeal swab that we do, is to take fragments of the virus in the back of your nasal cavity and put it on a medium and grow it out and see if it happens. If you don't have enough of a viral load, you won't have enough for us to test. Now, that's not always the case, and I can tell you I've learned a lot over the last couple of weeks from our doctors in town that work with us every day. There are viruses that stay with you forever when you're asymptomatic and never an issue. So mono is one of them, right. Where you could be very sick with mono for an acute period of time, get better, and years later still test positive for mono. Different. And this testing mechanism is different than an antibody testing, a serological testing, where they take a drop of blood or draw blood, and they look for the presence of antibodies. The PCR test does not look for antibodies. It doesn't tell you if you had it in the past or you were exposed. It tells you if you're currently sick right now. Now, there's two reasons why we tell people that they can't get tested unless they have symptoms. And one is kind of, based on this conversation we just had, common sense will tell you if you don't have symptoms, you might not have enough of a viral load for the test to detect something, so it might not be worth getting tested. But that's not the primary reason. The real reason why we're telling you have to have symptoms to get tested is because we don't have enough testing kits and enough swabs to do the testing. So if everybody in New Canaan went to get tested with a PCR test, there'd be no mechanism to test people that were sick and acute in the critical care beds in the hospitals. So that's kind of the rationale behind it. If we had unlimited testing, unlimited swabs, we would be testing everybody with a PCR test right now. But again, each of these techniques has a couple of drawbacks. One is the test new enough, it hasn't been validated that it actually works. But also, you could have, not a non-detected viral load today, get worse tomorrow, and need to be tested again tomorrow. So it really depends on when you've had your symptoms. So conventional wisdom tells you that between 3 and 7 days is when you'll start to develop your heaviest load, your worst symptoms, and that's kind of when the tests are most accurate for obvious reasons.
Yeah, thank you. So a question about the data. Some people are, in fact, looking at the data on the state website, town website, all over. So this is a question about the Connecticut website daily updates that are showing now decreases in hospitalizations. And so the question is whether the figures mean there are a lot more discharges are they from recoveries versus deaths? Do we know? Is it fewer people being admitted? So just if you can comment on that.
There's no one answer that covers that question. It's a combination of a multitude of factors. First and foremost, hospitalizations are down because we're social distancing effectively. So that's probably the most important message to drive home about that. There's no doubt that the actions we took weeks ago are leading to better outcomes today in terms of hospitalizations. That's number one. Number two, the data is a little bit fuzzy because I think fewer people are going to the hospitals until later, right? So I think people realize that there's a lot of infection in hospitals now. So I think people are staying home and trying to manage their illness longer before they go to the hospitals, which is probably okay, except for the fact that you're showing up at the hospital sicker. I also think that we've had a fair number of fatalities, unfortunately, which carries into that number. And also, you got to add into the fact that we've created some step-down units that are non-hospital related step-down units where people are being discharged now with symptoms, with positive testing back to a step-down nursing home unit in the state. And that's accounting for some of the decrease in the beds. But I don't want to minimize the positive news. The positive news is the capacity in the hospitals is better today than it was yesterday and better than it was the day before. And that's a good thing.
So the people who are discharged to a step-down unit, they are not counted in hospital beds, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
They're not in a hospital bed. That's correct.
Right. Okay. And so speaking of step-down units, we're standing one up here in New Canaan at Silver Hill Hospital. You want to say a word about that?
Sure. So we've been working for weeks, if not, I guess it's over a month now, on exactly that, is creating 26 to 30 beds at the acute care unit at Silver Hill Hospital. One would think that the most challenging aspect of this was to get Silver Hill and Waveney Care Center to work together to do this. It wasn't. One would think the most difficult thing was to find staffing to fill and support 30 beds at the acute care unit. That was not the biggest challenge. One would think that being able to get the hospitals comfortable discharging patients to the step-down unit would be the challenge. That was not the issue. Unfortunately, this is just a bureaucratic red tape nightmare that's keeping this facility from being stood up. Now, one of two things is going to happen. Either, actually one of three things. I'm optimistic. One of three things. Either the state will get out of its own way and sign off on what needs to happen for Russ Barksdale and the great staff at Waveney to support that unit, and that'll open immediately. Or the demand is going to be so great at the hospitals again at some point, they're going to force it to happen that way, which I don't think is a good option. The other way is we'll just continue to social distance to this point and keep the hospitalization rate down where the need will be less. But I think it's a very good option. I can tell you, just in terms of nursing homes, some data that I saw late last week concerning. There are nursing homes in the country that had 0 positive cases in the home. 0, which is not easy to do. You need to have complete control over your staff, complete control over your patients, isolate everybody, and really be lucky. Unfortunately, a little bit of luck has to be played in. But there were hospitals that discharged positive patients back to the nursing homes. And I think in New York State, the mandate was that you couldn't turn down a patient because they were positive, so they had to take them back. And even though they did their best to try to isolate those patients they got back into the home, 2 things happened. One, the patients that were recovering from COVID-19 in the home got better, but the mortality rate of those around them got dramatically worse. So what's amazing is that it shows that if we ever can get to a point where we have a dedicated unit for these patients to leave the hospitals back to the homes, it's not just better for them, it's dramatically better for the at-risk seniors in the homes they'd be going back to without that unit. So I think there's still a need to do it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
So back to testing, someone asks, why is New York administering thousands of antibody tests, according to the governor, if they're not accurate?
So I can't speak for the governor of New York. I applaud their efforts. I think they've created their own test out of their health department, and they're administering their own tests, which is something that we could do if we had the wherewithal to do it in Connecticut. I think we have taken a path of really relying on the private sector to solve this problem for us, which means LabCorp and Quest are the ones that are really doing most of the analysis of the testing for us. I think the governor of Connecticut's path, I'm not suggesting that it's wrong or right, I'm just suggesting that his path has been to partner with Quest and to see if the private sector can kind of handle this for us, whereas New York took a very different approach, and they developed their own lab at their Department of Health, and they're pushing that out. I would also just warn you that the data sample in New York was a relatively small data sample. This 21% infection rate or exposure rate is Again, take it with a grain of salt. The data sample is small. The testing efficacy is unknown, and hopefully it's accurate. But again, if you have that data, I'm not sure what we do with it. It's fun to talk about, but I don't know if I knew 20% of the town was exposed and developed antibodies, I couldn't act on it until I knew if the antibodies were enough to prevent reinfection. So we still have a little ways to go.
This person writes about her mother who went into Stonington Village yesterday and found that it was mobbed. People were all over the place, not wearing masks, not distancing. When the Stonington police were called, they said there wasn't anything that they could do about it. Is there anything that the towns can actually do to enforce
Yes.
the guidelines?
We can be very thankful that we live in New Canaan, and we should. And I, for one, appreciate it, both as a resident and someone who sits in the chair that I sit in. I think the fact that we are able to affect major disruptive change in our lives without having to have a heavy hand of enforcement to do it is why we're a pretty special town. I think as people, as their patience wears thin, I think this will get more and more difficult. But people need to recognize that increasing, social gatherings, reducing social distancing, if it's not done in a very controlled manner, is going to lead to an increase in hospitalizations and an increase in poor outcomes for seniors and at-risk residents. So we've always said from the beginning, we can't, as a police force, really enforce widespread change on anybody. All we can do is really educate the public and give them the facts as to why it's smart for them. And fortunately in New Canaan, people are educated enough to know that the reason why we're telling them to do something matters, and they're doing it. If it comes down to brute force and criminal enforcement, bad idea for everybody.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, and so along those lines, so a move that probably made a lot of people happy started today, right? The walking trails are open again. Anything you want to say about that as reminders for people?
Sure. If anyone is outside and they're able to wear a mask, they should wear a mask. Opening up the walking trails should not be a sign that it's safe to be out and mingling and walking in the trails. It's simply a function of, at least on my mind, reducing the risk of motor vehicle accidents with pedestrians as people are walking in the streets. So it bears repeating. If you're going to be on the trails walking, I strongly encourage you to wear a mask. For the point you just made a second ago with the prior question, we didn't make it a mandate, because if we make it a mandate, what tends to happen is people will call the police saying, Mike Handler wasn't wearing a mask, I want him arrested, and the police aren't going to do that. Or worse, Jill's going to come up to me and say, Mike, you're not wearing a mask, you need to wear a mask and start taking actions in your own hands. And we don't want vigilante enforcement going on in town. So I made it a suggestion because we think it really should strongly be suggested you wear a mask. If you're going to walk in town still, I can't stress this enough. Walk, run against oncoming vehicular traffic, especially on sidewalks. So if you think South Avenue, for example, if everyone walks against traffic, you will have one-way traffic on our sidewalks and greatly reduce the risk that oncoming opposing people will actually spread the virus. So we're happy to open the trails. We did not open anything else in town. So the playgrounds, the fields, tennis courts, track, everything else remains closed. If the trails become an issue, we'll have to take additional action and close them again, but I hope that's not the case.
So just as you were speaking, somebody wrote in and said, will there be a one-way plan for the walking trails in some way?
So strongly, we can throw it out there today. It's suggested you walk clockwise if you can. Recognize that not everyone's going to be able to do that. Not because they don't know what clockwise is, because they're coming in parks in different ways, trying to get to different places. But if it's not being adhered to, you can't take matters into your own hands and try to force someone to do something they're not willing to do. So again, whatever we can do to be smart about it, I encourage people to use their heads and be smart about it.
Okay, thank you. And back to people trying to understand how they can live day to day. There's been news about infections among people who work in meatpacking plants. So what would you say about whether it's okay to eat meat?
So I'm not going to give you a statement whether or not it's okay or not to eat meat. I can tell you the facts, and everyone can make their own decision. I think from the very beginning, even before we even came and started speaking, Peter, I've always been concerned about the food supply. That has been in town. There are things that we, long ago started planning for, and disruption in the food supply chain was on the top of the list. So again, I think everything comes down to how much individual risk a person's willing to take. You should not for a second think that because one of the meatpacking businesses has positive cases among their staff is unique to that plant. I think anywhere you are where you have increased exposure because you're not social distancing because you're providing an essential service, you have more risk, guaranteed. So that's why nursing homes and communal livings have more exposure. That's why grocery stores have checkout cashiers and stock people that are getting sick because they're risking themselves being there, which is why we call them heroes now. So as far as what risk you're willing to take, that's an individual decision. I can tell you personally, we have not stopped eating meat because of what's happening in the plants. I wouldn't eat raw meat. I wouldn't have eaten raw meat before this, but I think it's important to understand the risk you're taking and why you're taking it. And if it's okay with you, that's a family decision.
Thank you. And just another, how many times can you wear a disposable mask?
As many times as you want. So they don't degrade. But again, you should only be wearing this mask if you're going out for essential needs. So if you're only going to the grocery store for an hour or half an hour, you're going to pick up pharmaceuticals, and you can wear it, and you can leave it on your rearview mirror, and you can wear it as often as you want. It wasn't meant to be a permanent solution to this by any means. We're going to have to get to cloth masks and reusable washable masks at some point, and we're working for a solution for the town. We haven't made a decision yet, but the cloth mask, reusable mask, your bandana, all these things are going to be pretty widespread. And I'll tell you one more thing about the masks and the trails. It may seem unnatural to go for a walk on a trail with a mask on, but you're going to be wearing a mask everywhere you go. In order for us to re-engage the community safely, you'll be wearing a mask every day wherever you go as soon as you leave your house. So get used to it.
So speaking of the walking trails, while Father Peter's opening that, so other than Waveney, any other walking trails open? Land Trust?
All walking trails in town are open.
So the Land Trust trails?
So I don't like to speak for the Land Trust.
Okay.
They have followed us in our closure. I suspect they will follow us in our reopening, but that's up to the Land Trust.
Okay, so if people want to understand where they can walk, perhaps they should look at the town website and the Land Trust website?
Please.
Okay. And can you help people identify exactly where on the town website the data is, the testing and hospital data?
So if you go to www.newcanaan.info, that's the town's website. On the bottom right-hand, if you're on a computer, the very bottom right-hand corner of the screen has a black box that says COVID-19. You can click on the link there. That'll bring you to the page that we created just for COVID-19. The very top thing you should see on that page is my most recent outcall, the email text that's there. The very second thing you should see, it was yesterday, we took it off, was the mass distribution plan that came off. We replaced it with two sets of data. So one is the demographic data for the town, male, female, and whether or not they were Silver Hill or Waveney Care Center testing positive. And then the second link should be the daily data in terms of infections and fatalities.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And
you want to show you?
I put a chart up there, Jill. I did put some charts up there because I was able to. It doesn't mean that's the only way to look at the data. I also left the raw data up so anybody that has better analytical skills than I do can certainly go back and try to recreate whatever they want. And as far as updating it, we'll update it every so often. So it won't be every day, but we'll do it as we get more data dumps from the state or from the hospitals. We'll put more data in.
Okay, sounds good. Oh, thank you, Penny Young. Penny Young just wrote in, Land Trust Trails open Monday. There was an email last night.
There you go.
So there you go, everybody. Okay.
Okay, wow, thank you for that, and thank you everybody out there. Mike, just a word about, we talked about what the town is doing, what we want out of individuals, and there are many organizations in the community that are also going to face much ambiguity in the days to come. Just to name some of those sorts of things are for people in my business, we'd like to bury our loved one. Can we have a funeral where everybody is 6 feet apart? Can we have a wedding? Somebody called me about a wedding the other day, and I said, do you want me to stand out in your backyard and shout at everybody 20 feet away? Do you? Kind of thing. And so many of the businesses, as I understand it, in the state of Connecticut, 2/3 of businesses have remained open. 1/3 have shut, and then there are many that are open.
Sorry, repeat that one more time.
I read that 2/3 of businesses in the state of Connecticut were open, and that 1/3 were shut.
So it depends on what you consider open. So some offices are considered open but working remotely. So really, I would question that 2/3 number.
Okay, so thank you for that. This was something I read in some feed that comes by my face, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. So the people who are on the staff here, they're working 7 days a week, but they're working from their homes.
Correct.
And at some point, businesses where people are at home are going to be asked to come in, and can we now regather in the office or whatever place? And there's going to be pressure brought from both ends. I want to stay away. I want to come back together. This is something I see as an ambiguous place that is not far off, but in the weeks to come, owners of businesses are going to have to make judgments on things. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And I've talked to a lot of CEOs and business leaders and owners of companies over the last several weeks. And I think the most thoughtful, intelligent, caring response I've seen from a few, more than just a few, have been that we're not going to draw our employees back to the office until they're comfortable coming back to work. And that's a very easy thing to say, very, very hard thing to actually do. These also happen to be the same leaders of industry that have put a lot of effort into ensuring that productivity is still there while people are working remotely or in different ways than they've worked before. So I think it's not surprising that they're thoughtful in both aspects of this equation, but the fact is you're seeing what's happening in some ways in Georgia right now, where a governor's made a decision to open up the state, and the mayors are saying, no, thank you. I don't think you can force people to risk their lives to go to work, nor should you. But you also have to weigh that against the hysteria of never being able to go back to work, and it's never going to be okay. Again, this comes down to how much risk we want to take. As time goes on, we will get better data. We'll get better at protecting individuals. We'll get better at making workplace changes that people never thought of before. Those elevators that used to have 10, 12 people up to load a building up in the morning will now have 2 or 3 people or 4 people in an elevator.
Oh, interesting.
These things are all going to change. So things like staggered shifts, there's dramatically different ways of doing things that we're all going to learn. It's going to be a 9/11 moment for all of us. Only instead of traveling sporadically, it's going to be every day at work. And at some point, I'm of the view that we should put all of our effort towards making improvements to make it as safe as possible. But I don't love the idea of forcing people back into a situation where they're not safe. And it's bad for the business. Getting everyone back to work and getting them all sick does not help the business either. So a lot of thought has to go into it.
Thank you for that. We're watching the world come and go. I just opened this mask here. This is a 3M NextCare 8550 Plus, and it's made by 3M, and it's all the writing is in Chinese. And this comes from Hilton Chow, one of my son's best friends. He's a roommate from 6th grade. And Hilton lives in Taiwan, and he sent us the mask because he thought we needed some help. I love that. That and some ramen noodles. Thanks, Hilton. Anyway, just to finish up here, next time we get together, next Sunday morning with Mike, everybody, one of the topics we'd like to touch on is how to speak with your children about this. This is something that we've been talking about during the week, and we're going to see how we might touch that next week. And as always, I want to finish with a thank you to you. Thank you to all the officials in the community that are working on this. Thank you to those who are not just first responders, but they are face-to-face people.
Let's also thank their families, because they're sacrificing a lot.
Amen. Amen. And I want to thank everybody in the community also for the gracefulness with which so many of you are handling yourselves during this time. It is a measure of our culture that when the going gets tough, we stay calm and carry on, and we do that with grace. So peace and blessings to all of you. Mike, God bless you and thank you. And as always, thank you to your wife. I want to score a point with my sister. Okay, everybody, God bless you. Take care. See you next Sunday.